Last fall, when I was invited to teach this course, I said, well, it should be interesting. There'll be a lot of students. And all I have to do is, I was hesitant to do it, and then they told me I could put all my slides and everything on the computer, so I don't have to draw things myself. The last time I drew things was in the 7th grade, and the teacher suggested I take wood shop. And so I took a...
Just go on and teach the best you can. I'll work on it.
All right. So I took a sequence of 4 courses: wood shop, machine shop, print shop, and electric shop. And believe it or not, I teach a graduate course in bibliography of methods of research, and I'm probably the only one on the campus capable to teach it because of that 7th grade print shop. Because we set type by hand the way they did in the 17th and 18th century, and I know how to do it. So you never know what you take, what you do, and what courses may ultimately help you as you proceed. As soon as that red light goes on, I think I'm supposed to start. Jim, am I... Yeah, the green light is what I meant. This course is an introduction to the novel, English 3324, and we have a graduate section 7396. You've signed up for a course called An Introduction to the Novel, and one of the things you want to know is what a novel is. By definition, it's obviously something different from other genres such as epic poetry and lyric poetry, satire, comedy, pastoral poetry, elegies, eulogies, and epitaphs. There are a number of places you can look to find out where to find definitions of the novel, and I'm going to spend a few moments at the beginning of this session talking about what the novel really is. A very early book describing the novel is one by Charlotte Morgan, M-O-R-G-A-N, called The Rise of the Novel of Manners, a study of prose fiction between 1600 and 1740. That book was published in 1911. A very important book for our period is Ian Watt, W-A-T-T, a book called The Rise of the Novel, Studies in Defoe, Richardson, and Fielding. This was written in 1960. For a summary of the types of novels that existed, but not necessarily a full detail of the novels that you're interested in reading, is one by Lionel Stevenson called The English Novel. Stevenson actually was a visiting professor on campus in some years ago and stayed with us a year and wrote the English novel. Are we off the air or on the air?
We're on to the remote sites.
Oh,
But
okay. Stevenson's book has a lot of detail and a lot of titles, and it's a good summary. People studying for doctoral examinations would find themselves at an advantage using this book. In 1965, Robert Bone wrote a book called The Negro Novel in America. In 1958, it was revised in 1965 and deals with a lot of the early novelists. Of course, many of the most recent novelists are not in that book, and you have to go for a more recent study. A rather important book is Frederick Carl, K-A-R-L. Carl wrote a book called The Adversary Company. An adversary is someone whom you don't like, and he characterizes the novel as being something subversive of the society. And the adversary company came out in 1974, and I think it's one of the most important books in the field. He focuses on the 18th century novel, and we're going to start on the 18th century novel, and you'll get some idea of what's really happening there. A recent novelist, a recent study of the novel, is Michael McKeon, who wrote The Origins of the English Novel. McKeon is M-C-K-E-O-N, Michael McKeon. And he published a book with Johns Hopkins Press in 1987, which is basically an historical novel. It's a novel that deals with sociological issues and deals with historical issues. And then in 1990, J. Paul Hunter, who is at the University of Chicago, wrote a book called Before Novels, The Cultural Contents of 18th Century English Fiction. Now, I'd like to talk about some of the issues that these people raise. There's a very distinct difference between what the novel is today and what it was when it was evolving as a novelistic form in the 18th century, and the narrative tales that you used to read in biblical literature, in classical literature, in medieval literature, and in the fantastic literature of, let's say, Spenser's The Faerie Queene. There are certain things that happen in this literature. Much of the literature in the Bible, for example, is literature intended to present a message by giving us general issues. For example, when you read the book of Esther in the Bible, you're reading a plot in which Haman, an evil man, was out to kill the Jews, got the assistance of his niece Esther to Haman was out to kill the Jews, and Esther, who was the wife of the king, called her uncle Mordecai to come to help. And by virtue of a series of actions, Haman was accused of his crime against the people, and he was hanged. Now, it sounds like a good story, and it's an important story, and it's a biblical story, and it seems to have a certain credibility. But there's a very close resemblance between Esther and the Persian myth of Ishtar, and between her ally Marduk and the Hebrew uncle Mordecai, and between the enemy Haman and the Hebrew Haman. So what you have is a story that has certain correspondences. Now, whether the story actually happened or whether in some ways it is a correspondence of a mythos that transcends nations is an interesting story to tell. In the Odyssey, when Ulysses discovers his men have been turned into swine, he rushes to help them, and with a moly root persuades Circe to change them back into human beings. And Circe changes them back into human beings at his persuasion, and then Ulysses lives with her for a year and a day. Now, why would he live with her for a year and a day after having rescued his men and knowing that he has this voyage to get back home to his wife who's waiting and knitting this garb against her suitors and destroying it every night so she isn't seduced? Well, one of the reasons he has to stay with her is because he has to teach her that men shouldn't be treated like swine. Now, you may agree or not agree with that, but it takes a long time. But why a year and a day? Well, a year and a day, we find out, is a unique term. It's used in the Bible, at least on a number of occasions. In Deuteronomy, if a husband is married, newly married, he's not supposed to leave his wife for a year and a day. And if he moves into a new house with his family, he's not supposed to leave home, literally from the neighborhood or at night, for a year and a day. So this year and a day, you see, is not a literal time transfixion. It's really a transmission of a message. And the message is that a year must pass for events to secure themselves, and then you have to add that day to let them move on again. So a year and a day is a very important concept, but it's not a concept of time in the sense of the traditional novel where you see a day pass and someone meets someone else and events occur. By the way, the same technique urges in Chaucer's The Knight's Tale, when a knight who ravishes a woman is sentenced to death. But he's such a good-looking guy that all the women rush to protect him and urge King Arthur not to slay him, not to kill him, but to give him the chance to find out the secret to a question. And the question is, what is it that women desire most? Now, how long do you think that this knight wanders before he arrives at the answer? A year and a day. And on that final day, he's walking through the woods, walking along the path, and he hears a loathly hag along the road. And he gets off the road, and she reveals to him the secret, what it is that women desire most. But Chaucer doesn't tell us. Chaucer waits until he returns to the castle, and he's asked what it is women desire most. Now, before she told him, the old woman, the loathly hag, the hag with rheumy eyes, and an ugly complexion, ugly appearance, exacted from the knight a promise that he would do anything she asked of him. And as soon as she tells Arthur, what is it that women desire most? And the answer is domination at home. She approaches him and says she wants to marry him. Now, he is really repulsed by her. The knight does not want to marry this woman, but he made a promise to her. And so he marries her. Next, he's supposed to enjoy his wedding feast and then go to bed with her. But he's very reluctant to finish the wedding feast. He takes his time. Finally, at night, when he's supposed to consummate the marriage, she tells him that she can be beautiful by day but faithless to him, or ugly and faithful. He has his choice. He tells her, whatever you please. And he's given her the right to make the decisions. So she has dominance at home. Now, you see, this is a mythos. This is a myth. It's a story that never occurred. No loathly hags, no knights wandering along a path looking to meet a challenge. But the story has a message. And the message has to do with fidelity, and the message has to do with honor, and the message has to do with the way people, acculturate people, live together. So that the novel in this context, so when you read these narratives of the biblical narratives, and some of them are very, very some of them are historically based, no question about it. Some of them are not. Some of them took, the Psalms, for example, took 700 years to write, and so it's an historical study of events as they passed over time. But they're not a novel, and they're not events of the novel the way we know the novel today. Myths, in fact, according to this tradition, I'm going to quote a line from McKeon about what a myth is, and you may want to observe that. A myth is the dialectical motive of the archaic mind to tell a proleptic study. A proleptic is something that you think happens, and you're aware of it's happening, and you're aware of it's happening over time while you reflect upon it. so as to reach an originating realm of ends, an idea that is inaccessible by more direct means. You just are not going to learn these messages by direct means. I think that we have an effort in our society to keep youngsters from taking drugs, and one of the programs is just say no. Well, you can say no all you want, but that's a very direct means of asking someone to do something he doesn't want to do. And so a lot of stories are told by indirect means. Socrates discusses myth in his preamble to the myth of the charioteer in the Phaedrus. He says it's a long tale to tell. A myth is a long tale to tell. And most assuredly, a god alone could tell it. But a man might tell it in briefer compass. Now, what does that mean? That means if you really want to study the myths of society and see how the gods act out the tales, you're going to be following a lifelong search for truth. Whereas man takes this lifelong search for truth and compresses it into a small surface, into a mythic tale, and in that way puts across his idea. Of course, none of that still is the modern novel. What differentiates the modern novel from these myths? Well, according to Ian Watt in his book, there are several specifications for the novel. And those of you who can see it on the screen can follow me on this computer. One is formal realism. There is an effort to give us real people and real actions in a formal manner. So formal realism is one quality, and I want you to write that down. The next are narrative procedures. Narrative procedures. Among the narrative procedures is the repudiation of traditional plots, where something happens and something next happens and something concludes it. Plots have ways of convoluting into each other. There's a movie out called Pulp Fiction, which gives you some idea of how plots convolute. If you've seen that movie, you see an interesting way that plots are interposed in plots out of time. But there is a structural unity to the novel, a structural unity in which you can understand the way the novelist has scoped out this novel, has plotted it, has designed it, and moves it along. The novel, at least in the 18th century, has a particular type of individual characters. You're not just going to get a knight who's in trouble, a loathly hag who is allegorical. You're not going to find Circe, a witch who can seduce men. You're going to find real people. You're going to find a woman who can seduce men. Her name may be Angela, her main name may be Moll, her name may be Madame de Renal, her name may be Molly. It may be any of the names of the characters we're going to study this semester. But it becomes a real person. The background for the novels becomes relatively important in the modern novel. You know where people live. They live in London. They live in Paris. They live in Bourges. They live in West Texas. They live in Homewood in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We know where they live. You don't know where knights live. In fact, most of the English knights you think you're looking at in England are in France, because the chivalric code and so much of French literature transposed itself into English literature relatively quickly. So place is identifiable and place is important in the novel. By the way, Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, was interested in Milton's Paradise Lost. And he said, how can you really appreciate heaven and hell when they both look like Italy? This was his criticism of Paradise Lost. Not only do you have individual characters and background, but you have names that sound realistic. Abraham in the Bible can come from two words. It can come from Av, which means father, and Am, which means people, father of the people. And you put Av, Ham, Am together, you get Abraham in some configuration. Or Ishmael in Moby Dick. That's a novel, but the word Ishmael is a Hebrew term, and it's in the Bible, and Ish means man, and El means, is the partitive genitive, and the word El means God. So Ishmael is a man from God, which was what happened in the Bible. Isaac is not just a name in the Bible, it means laughter. Sarah laughed when she found out she was going to have a child. She's an old woman and she was going to have a child, so she laughed. So his name becomes Isaac. Incidentally, modern writers in Israel have a real tough time with names. If you name a character, because they all study the Bible closely, if you name a character David, the question is, are you going to design him as being a hero and a warrior, or are you going to picture him as an adulterer and a reprobate? You know, how is your character going to look? If you name a character Amnon, whose sister is he going to rape? You see, his own or someone else's? And if it doesn't happen, they say, well, why did you name this character this character? He doesn't have a symbolic configuration. There's a causation in the novels. You assume that things are going to happen in these novels because certain events have moved them on to happen. And so causation becomes a certain characteristic of the novel. You're moving on and you're hoping that things will explain themselves. So that what you have is an illusion of reality and a long fictitious, in any long fictitious prose paragraph. Now Frederick Carl goes on to say a little bit more about what a novel contains and what makes it modern and what makes it realistic. By the way, we're not talking about length, although most novels are quite lengthy. But some short stories are lengthier than some novels. So length is not the pure prediction of what a novel could be. But according to Frederick Carl, one of the characteristics about the modern novel is its focus on individuality. Now let's talk about individuality for a few moments, because the Enlightenment is a very, very important part of this individual experience. And I want to tell you whom we're talking about. All the modern theorists on the novel have no doubt that the philosophy of René Descartes, the pragmatism of John Locke, the psychology of Thomas Hobbes, and the structures of Sir Isaac Newton, which ushered in the age of rationalism, have perhaps the largest influence of all upon the nature of the realistic novel, because we are actually moving. Part of the reasons we're moving away from the mythos to realism is the rationalism of society. Let me repeat those names. René Descartes lived from 1596 to 1650. At a time of the terrible, terrible, and terrific religious wars in England. And Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. This man who was in the Netherlands and philosophized that the individual himself is the center of existence, revolutionized the philosophy of mankind by turning it from a religiously oriented world to an individually oriented world. Now, this doesn't mean that anyone denied religion or objected to religion or doesn't feel the importance of religion. But religion became less dogmatic and more responsive to individuality. And René Descartes was one of the first. In a book he wrote called Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting the Reason and Seeking for Truth in the Sciences. John Locke, who lived from 1632 to 1704, he overlaps Descartes, is perhaps the father of all rationalistic thinking in the modern literature. His philosophy was the philosophy that laid the basis for the Constitution of the United States, and it's a philosophy we follow closely today. Thomas Hobbes lived from 1588 to 1679. Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan, in which he tried to study the psychology of mankind. And his view of mankind was that man needs controls, very desperate controls. And finally, Sir Isaac Newton. Sir Isaac Newton, who lived from 1642 to 1727, came up with certain proofs of the structure of society, so that, number one, society had an orderly mechanism that could be explained by the existence of God or could be explained by natural forces. And it's the natural forces that seem to exert influence in this way, although Isaac Newton would never have denied the deity. Not only does Newton demonstrate that there are natural forces at work, but he proves that there is causation, and that once you assume that events can occur sequentially and for a reason and repeat themselves, then you have some basis for rational thinking. And rationalism is based on the principle that you can move. If you know what you want to do and you know the direction to take, then systematically you move in that procedure, in that order. We live in the 20th century. And a lot of these ideas were refuted by Einstein, who gives us a theory of relativity rather than a theory of absolutism. We walked in the classroom in the beginning of the 20th century and said, hey, you youngsters have to study Latin and geometry and chemistry, and then you'll know what to do. And you study morality, say prayers, and you will know how to behave, and everything will work out right. Well, Einstein says that things are relative. Sometimes the books you want people to read are not the books that they're going to read. They're going to learn from other places. Sometimes the prayers you want to say are not the same prayers other people say, and therefore you have to demonstrate more toleration. And sometimes even the direction you provide people doesn't work out because you're not fully familiar with all the forces that exert themselves on you that may in fact impinge upon decisions and change this orderly prescribed set of events that leads a person from infancy to maturity. In fact, one of the theories that scientists are perpetuating today is not causation and not an orderly and rational, systematic understanding and development of theory to conclusion, but theories of chaos that say the world is so complex and decisions so differentiated that many of the things we plan are absolutely unpredictable. Absolutely unpredictable. So today's world is theorized as being both complex and unpredictable, whereas the world in which the novel was developing into a novel of formal realism is a world that is conceived of as being causative and predictable. And so we have a different way of looking at things. Now, let me move on. All right. There are other things I can say about what the novel is and what the novel is not. One of the things that I'd like to mention to you is that in the 17th century there were a lot of romances written. Romances are novels that have happy endings, purely contrived plots, characters who are perhaps not as well plotted as we would like them to be. I'll give you the names of some of these novels, just so you have some idea what we're talking about. The English Rogue, written by Richard Head in about 1665. One of the novels. The Duchess of Newcastle wrote a book called Nature's Pictures by Fancy's Pencil. 211 sociable letters. Aphra Behn, who was a famous woman writer of the time, wrote a number of works. One of her books in 1684 was love letters between a nobleman and his sister. Another book she has is in I don't have the date for this. Between 1687 and 1688, right. She wrote The Adventures of the Black Lady, The Wandering Beauty, The Unhappy Mistake, and The Unfortunate Happy Lady. These are various stories that give you some idea of the generic quality of these characters. They're not named. She has a story called The Dumb Virgin, a story of the son of a Venetian nobleman lost at sea, who's rescued by an English ship, visits Venice when he grows up, and unwittingly marries a beautiful woman who is in truth his sister. So he commits incest, and a beautiful relationship turns into a terrible thing. But The Fair Jilt by Aphra Behn. She does an interesting thing. She writes a number of her novels as though she's there. And one of her famous novels is one called Orinoco, or The Royal Slave, in which a hero is sold into slavery, and in the New World meets the woman whom he loved in Africa, but in a state of slavery he doesn't want either of them to live, and so he slays her and her while she's pregnant, and then hopes to lead an insurrection, but is so enervated by the experience that he becomes sickly, is captured by the plantation owners and tortured before he dies. These are some of the early novels. These are some of the titles of novels, and they ought to be read. But we're not going to read them. What we're going to read are a series of novels that I'm going to tell you about very quickly, and then I'm going to focus on the first novel that you're going to study, which is Pilgrim's Progress. So if you look on your syllabus, what I'm pulling up on the screen now, if you have it or you don't have it, is the syllabus. Now, in this course, I've projected 10 works. I know it's a heavy reading schedule. Some of you may read all of them. Some of you may only get to read 8 of them. You can exempt one from each of your midterm and final exam. The first is John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, written in 1678. The second part in 1684. Now, Pilgrim's Progress is not the realistic novel that we're going to be getting into, but it's a very important work because it does, in fact, give us an allegory in which characters seem to take on the psychological movement of real people. And when that happens, then we're able to project from Pilgrim's Progress events that are going to happen in the second novel you're going to look at, which is Moll Flanders, the story of a woman who wishes to be a lady, but who, through circumstances, through economic necessity, is forced into, first of all, a relationship with the brother of a man who has seduced her. And then when that man dies, she finds herself without a livelihood, and in various ways she meets other men whom she accommodates and who accommodate her. Marrying, among other a man in England, whom she later discovers when she goes with him to America to be her half-brother. That's an interesting story. We pick up newspapers today, you read about incest, you read about all kinds of problems. You pick up the talk shows and you read them all. Nothing's new. The 18th century novel will show you that the events of human life seem to repeat themselves from century to century. Now, Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory. We're going to talk about that in the last hour of this class. But Moll Flanders is the realistic application of the events of Pilgrim's Progress. So you're going to read Moll Flanders as though it's a real person acting the way the allegorical characters did in Pilgrim's Progress. The third novel, Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, is really an experimental novel. A man looks back on his life and begins to write about it. And he wants to know why he turned out the way he has, in spite of all the planning of his father and all the plans of his mother. And there's a great deal of Lockean satire against John Locke, and literature on behalf of John Locke in this particular work. Stendhal's The Red and the Black, Julien Sorel, the hero of The Red and the Black, you should not like, you will not like, and you will find him one of the detestable people in all of literature. But it's a novel you will be compelled to read because Sorel is such an SOB. We move on to Herman Melville's Redburn, the story of a young man at sea, and what he finds to be the problem of his education. How does a young man with no knowledge suddenly become knowledgeable in language, in customs, in traditions, and in the nature of evil? And when you read Redburn, sometimes it's best to read Melville's philosophical chapters than to read for plot at all. Franz Kafka in 1926 gives us The Castle. Kafka, who wrote The Metamorphoses. We'll talk about that story. A man awakes one morning to discover that he's been metamorphosed into a large bug. And the question is, what happens to a person who no longer is accepted in the world and then discovers he's useless to anyone else in the world? We move on from there. Well, I should have shown you. This is the edition of Pilgrim's Progress we're going to be using. Moll Flanders. Tristram Shandy, I have the Norton edition because it has a lot of essays and will help explain what's happening there. Also, The Red and the Black. Brought you an inexpensive version of Redburn, since it's the only version available. Kafka's The Castle. You can, hopefully these are in our bookstore. They're certainly available at North Houston Institute and West Houston Institute. They what?
They haven't been ordered.
Well, I've been sending them letters since last semester, so I can't imagine why not. They haven't been ordered?
They told me to talk to you.
Well, they're all available at Bookstop and at other places. Gertrude Stein's Ida is a story about a woman in minimalist language. Leaving Cheyenne by Larry McMurtry is a contemporary American fiction. And the last book, The Hiding Place by John Weidman, is a rather impressive book. It deals with a young black man who has committed a crime, who flees the site of the crime, and finds himself in contention with a very old woman, a black woman. And the novel is entirely a dialogue between the two of them. For the most part, a dialogue between the two of them. Weidman, who teaches at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, says he conceived the whole novel in his head in one moment. And then it was just a matter of getting it out very fast. You'll see what you think about it when you read the novel. But each of these novels is something you can deal with, and when you write your critical paper, you'll deal with one book, and when you write your research paper, you'll deal with another, and we'll talk about those. And for the midterm, the first 5 novels will be on the midterm, and you may select 4 to deal with, and the last 5 will be on the final, and you'll deal with that. Now what I'd like to do is move on to a discussion of what's happening in this period and what leads us into Pilgrim's Progress. Because Pilgrim's Progress is an allegory, and we'll talk about it in a few moments. And in an allegory, you have characters who are supposed to engage in true acts to find ultimate truth. And the story of Pilgrim's Progress is essentially the story of Christian who realizes that he wants to leave the city of destruction and go to the city of Zion. And how does Christian find the path to the city of Zion, the city of hope? What obstacles does he confront? What helps does he have? What assistance does he have? And how does he move from his origin to his salvation? That essentially is the purpose of Pilgrim's Progress, written by John Bunyan, who was born in 1628. What I want to do is mention to you some of the problems that people had when Bunyan wrote this book. He wrote it in jail, and why he was in jail is going to be part of the story that I want to mention to you in a few moments. Because Bunyan, who wrote Pilgrim's Progress, is a dissenter. He dissents from the religion of the Anglican Church. And anyone who dissents from the religion of the Anglican Church in the 17th century could find himself subjected to severe punishments. Why did that happen and how did it happen? Let's talk for a few moments. In 1547, the Supremacy Act established in England a church apart from the Roman Catholic Church. When Henry VIII split from the Roman Catholic Church, he was interested in establishing a non-papal national church and a Catholic church that adhered to principles of faith, using sacraments, but maintaining the episcopacy, the control, a church under control of a political entity. The Supremacy Act declared that the sovereign of England was the supreme ruler of the church. And Queen Elizabeth did a number of things to make sure that the church was ruled not by the Pope, but by herself and by future kings of England. And this is the very basic thing. You all know the story. You know the story of why Henry VIII broke away from the church. I'm not going to get into that. But in 1552, an Act of Uniformity was passed. It authorized a new prayer book, the Book of Common Prayer. It eliminated from that book the petition of litany from the Pope. It separated the Anglican Church from the practices of the Roman Catholic Church. It eliminated, it kept in certain prayers, omitted other prayers, but it was really quite a difficult transition for many people. In 1588, from 1588 to 1603, there were a number of situations, and on one occasion, at least 100 people were hanged, punished by the rack, punished by thumbscrews and other tortures, because they would not submit to the Anglican Church and wanted to practice their religion by the Roman Catholic Church. These recusants, people who recused themselves from the Anglican Church and chose to practice the Roman Catholic Church, were punished and were in fact prevented from practicing their religion or practicing the religion they wanted. Francis Bacon in 1592 objected to this and said, consciences are not to be forced. So from the very beginning you had a group of people who did not submit themselves to the rules of the Anglican Church established by Henry VIII and Queen Elizabeth, who wanted to remain Roman Catholics. By the same token, you had regular Protestants, Puritans, people who objected even to not only the Roman Catholic Church, but they objected to the fact that the Anglican Church chose to retain so many of the practices, so many of the holidays, so many of the events, so many of the rituals that the Roman Catholic Church had. They didn't even want priests or ministers to wear fancy garbs. They didn't want them to wear cloaks. They didn't want them to wear hats. They didn't want them to kneel in certain ways. They didn't want them. They didn't want the mass table in the on the side. They wanted it in the middle. There were so many things happening that indicated people were not only in disagreement with the Roman Catholic Church, but in disagreement with the Anglican Church, that you had other groups of people developing, and you had expression of Puritans who wanted a pure church, a church untrammeled with the trappings of the Roman Catholic Church. And then, of course, you had Anabaptists, you had later on Congregationalists, you had the Baptists. You have an interesting situation where in some cases the number of Anglicans in England, even though it was the majority religion, were in the minority. And always throughout this period, in an England that had maybe 7.5 million people, less than the state of Texas, at least a third of them were always dissenters from the Anglican Church. In 1641, Parliament got together and passed a number of acts on the divine right of kings, better ways to keep the king's day of accession. Parliament made laws to suppress the growth of popery. They made laws against unorthodox opinions on the Trinity, which were leveled against Anabaptists and separatists and people who didn't want to follow the Anglican Church. You had people who wanted to prevent innovations in doctrines, you had a number of issues that were in conflict with the Anglican Church. And by 1641, the Parliament was dominated by the Puritan movement, so that by 1642, Charles found himself alienated by all these changes that Parliament wanted to make, to the extent that ultimately he could not abide the changes. He opposed them so vigorously, and the Parliament didn't want that by 1649, Charles was executed. And there came to power the Parliament of Oliver Cromwell in 1649. And for 11 years, Cromwell ruled England as literally a fanatic Puritan leader. What were some of the things that he did to make sure that England was pure of Roman Catholic influence and even Anglican influence? He didn't want daily services. He wanted morning exercises. The observance of Christmas, Easter, and Whitsunday were all forbidden, because Christmas and Easter had become pagan holidays. People were celebrating with foreign objects. They were celebrating with trees. They were celebrating with gifts. They were celebrating with rituals that seemed to be of no consequence to the pure church and to the early primitive church established in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It may amaze you to think that for 11 years England didn't celebrate Christmas the way it's celebrated today, after the glorious holiday that everyone had just a few days ago. And yet it may cause us to wonder whether the holidays haven't transmogrified today again into rituals beyond belief that people may find some objection to. Marriages were to be secular, not church weddings. Weddings had become outlandish. Weddings were not meaningful. They were economic bonds. So the Protestant, the Commonwealth in 1649 under Oliver Cromwell said no marriages in church. Church marriages would be secular. They could be presided over by a minister or a priest, but not in a church. You would bury the dead without ceremony. The burials of the dead had become too vulgar. People were being buried in lavish crypts. Ceremonies were being extravagant ceremonies had evolved, and these to the Puritans seemed unnecessary. I would liken the Commonwealth government now, but mind you, they were establishing a religious government for that 11 years under Cromwell. One of the things that Cromwell did was to try to base England on early Hebraic culture. And the Jews who had been banned from England in 1290 but never forbidden from being there were brought back by Oliver Cromwell, who allowed them to establish synagogues in the year 1656, and by 1704 you had synagogues already established in England again. Now, what are some of the other problems? Let's talk about them in a moment. The Commonwealth was a very religious, puritanical government, a fanatic government. It really allowed no toleration whatsoever. I would liken Khomeini's government in Iran to the Commonwealth government of Oliver Cromwell. Well, it became so oppressive itself. No dancing, no singing, no holiday celebrations, almost a civilization of total oppression, that the people objected, and when Cromwell died, his son Richard came to the power but could not rule, and the English went back to France and brought back from France the son of Charles I, who had Charles I had been executed. They brought his son back from France, a 19-year-old man, to be King of England. And from 1660 to 1685, for 25 years, Charles II ruled England in a rather handsome way. It was really it's quite an amazing rule, because he had to reconcile these differences. These 3 million dissenters who did not follow the Anglican Church were supposed to come under his rule. The Anglicans, who had been oppressed by them for these terrible 11 years, had to come under his rule. His brother was an avowed Roman Catholic. His brother never gave up his Roman Catholicism and was allegedly, possibly going to be the next King of England. When Charles came to the throne, he accepted 2 premises. One was that he would be ruler of the Anglican Church, and after he came to the, and by 1673, he agreed to the passage of a Test Act. Now, what was the Test Act? The Test Act was an act that required everyone to agree to follow the rules of the Anglican Church. Now, let me tell you what happened. When Charles came to the throne, there was a degree of toleration. All the dissenters were given amnesty, except for who actually participated in the execution of Charles's father, and they themselves were executed. Generally, there was an uneasy peace. But as the Anglicans got more and more power and they realized they were going to be seated, by 1673, they passed the Test Act. And the Test Act excluded from public office anyone who refused to take the sacrament of the Church of England. Anyone. If you were not Roman Catholic, you could not hold a government office. You could not receive a pension from the government. You could not become probably a military officer. You could not attend Oxford or Cambridge or Trinity. Now, there were efforts among the Whigs were the liberals, to establish laws of occasional conformity. What was occasional conformity? Occasional conformity was a law that said, whatever you believed, if you went to the Anglican Church at the beginning of each year and said Mass according to the Anglican tradition, then everyone would look the other way if you practiced your own religion the way you wanted your own way. Now, a purist who was a dissenter said he would never do this. And many ministers did not, and they went to jail. And in 1673, a fellow by the name of Richard Baxter went to jail. And in this period, John Bunyan went to jail because they were preachers, dissenter preachers. They dissented from the Anglican Church. They preached their religion, and they weren't allowed to. And so they went to jail. Imagine going to jail for your belief, but it happens. And it happened then. Now, there are two people I'd like to talk about. One is Richard Baxter, this nonconformist preacher, and I'm going to tell you what he taught, what he believed, and what he thought. Because I think that he gives you a lot of background for what John Bunyan is doing in Pilgrim's Progress. And what we're going to do is get into into the traditions and beliefs of Richard Baxter, and then move into the beginnings of our study of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. And we're going to begin that right now. I'm going to have to ask how our time is at this point. 5 minutes? Okay. I know we're supposed to go into 2 75-minute segments. Maybe I should just ask if there are any questions at this point. I've given you a lot of information, and a lot of it has come to you relatively quickly.
So, Charles the second was Catholic, though, right? But he was still head of the Anglican Church.
Charles came to the throne in 1660. He agreed to be head of the Anglican Church. For all extended purposes, he ruled as an Anglican. He had some benefit because secretly he had an agreement with France to supply him large sums of money if Parliament wouldn't support him, which gave him a leeway to do things he wanted without the help of Parliament. But when he died in 1665, on his deathbed, he asked for the last rites of the Roman Catholic Church. His brother, the Duke of York, came to the throne in 1665, James II. Now, James was a Stuart. Charles was a Stuart. Charles I was a Stuart. James was Roman Catholic, and he began to reinstate toleration. In fact, he passed during his time a Toleration Act, which allowed people who were not Anglicans to get positions in the government, to get pensions, and to hold government jobs. Mind you, 3 million nonconformists, dissenters, liked the bill, even though they didn't like the idea that Roman Catholics were going to get an advantage. But, and people figured that when James died, there would be a happy succession. But James's wife gave birth to a son. And that was too much for the English people. They no longer could tolerate the prospect of James continuing and then a Roman Catholic lineage continuing. And so James was literally run out of office. He fled England and for France, where his family, his son and his grandson, became pretenders to the throne and held claim to the English throne until the death of Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1788, almost 100 years later. Now, who did the English bring to take over from James, because James was no longer King of England? They had to bypass almost 60 relatives of James II, all of whom were Roman Catholic, in order to find that, I'm sorry, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. They went to, I'm sorry, I'm getting really ahead of myself. I'm going into Queen Anne's Day, excuse me. They went to James's daughter, Mary. Mary was married to William of Orange of the Netherlands. And Mary, who was Anglican, brought her husband, who was Protestant, to rule England as William and Mary in 1689. Now, that created one more problem, and I'll tell you what the problem was. They weren't Stuarts. Now, Mary was a Stuart. Okay, Mary was a Stuart. William was not. This created problems. Some people claim that when William became king, they didn't want to swear allegiance to him because he was not a Stuart. And they were called non-jurors. They did not swear. So you had non-jurors who were Jacobites because they were friendly to James. They didn't want William and Mary on the throne. They wanted James's son on the throne, James II's son, who was living in France. Then they wanted his son. Then they wanted his grandson, Bonnie Prince Charlie. They were the ones. So for the next 100 years, you could have been a dissenter, and you could have been a non-juror, which means you had 2 strikes against you. Or you could have been an Anglican, and you could be a non-juror. But in the meantime, there was a great deal of dissension, a great deal of problem, a great deal of oppression, and little toleration. The Anglicans had little toleration. There was no toleration at all for Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics could not own homes in England. They didn't have citizenship. Alexander Pope, who was Roman Catholic, owned his home, but it was held in title by a Protestant aunt. you just had a lot of conflict, a lot of religious conflict, and we're going to talk a little bit more about this when we get into our discussion of Baxter and John Bunyan. The whole issue of toleration gained momentum when John Locke wrote his papers on toleration, in which the individualization of society ultimately led to principles as stated in 1688 by John Locke in the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and later on enunciated in the Constitution of the United States. So a lot of these political wars you see are settling themselves out, and by the end of the century, there will be a nation founded on the principle of religious freedom. And we're going to take a 10-minute break now. And I want to tell you that I'm not sure whether the people on the outlying campuses received this lecture. I assume they did. I'm not sure what they saw on the screen, whether they saw what I had on my screen and was looking at that you were allegedly supposed to have seen. But this experiment in electronics and the electronic highway is going to lead us on the straight path either to knowledge or oblivion, which is really the lesson that John Bunyan gives us in Pilgrim's Progress. Thank you.